The story of Samson, the strong man. Now, we are to learn of 3 judges who ruled Israel in turn. Their names were Ibzan, Elon, and Abdon. None of these were men of war, and in their days the land was quiet. But the people of Israel again began to worship idols, and as a punishment, God allowed them once more to pass under the power of their enemies. The 7th oppression, which now fell upon Israel, was by far the hardest, the longest, and the most widely spread of any, for it was all over the tribes. It came from the Philistines, a strong and warlike people who lived on the west of Israel upon the plain beside the Great Sea. They worshipped an idol called Dagon, which was made in the form of a fish's head on a man's body. These people, the Philistines, sent then armies up from the plain beside the sea to the mountains of Israel and overran all the land. They took away from the Israelites all their swords and spears, so that they could not fight, and they robbed their land of all the crops, so that the people suffered for want of food. And as before, the Israelites in their trouble cried out to the Lord, and the Lord heard their prayer. In the tribe land of Dan, which was next to the country of the Philistines, there was living a man named Manoah. One day an angel came to his wife and said, "You shall have a son, and when he grows up, he will begin to save Israel from the hand of the Philistines. But your son must never drink any wine or strong drink as long as he lives, and his hair must be allowed to grow long, and he must never be cut. For he shall be a Nazirite under a vow to the Lord." When a child was given especially to God, when a man gave himself to some work for God, he was forbidden to drink wine, and as a sign, his hair was left to grow long, while the vow or promise to God was upon him. Such a person as this was called a Nazirite, a word which means one who has a vow. And Manoah's child was to be a Nazirite, and under a vow, as long as he lived. The child was born and was named Samson. He grew up to become the strongest man of whom the Bible tells. Samson was no general like Gideon or Jephthah to call out his people and lead them in war. He did much to set his people free, but all that he did was by his own strength. When Samson became a young man, he went down to Timnath in the land of the Philistines. There he saw a young Philistine woman whom he loved and wished to have as his wife. His father and mother were not pleased that he should marry among the enemies of his own people. They did not know that God would make this marriage the means of bringing harm upon the Philistines and of helping the Israelites. As Samson was going down to Timnath to see this young woman, a hungry lion came out of the mountain, roaring against him. Samson seized the lion and tore him in pieces as easily as another man would have killed a little kid of the goats, and then went on his own way. He made his visit and came home, but said nothing to anyone about the lion. After a time, Samson went again to Timnath for his marriage with the Philistine woman. On his way, he stopped to look at the dead lion, and in its body he found a swarm of bees and honey which they had made. He took some of the honey and ate it as he walked, but told no one of it. At the wedding feast, which lasted a whole week, there were many Philistine young men, and they amused each other with questions and riddles. "I will give you a riddle," said Samson. "If you answer it during the feast, I will give you 30 suits of clothing. And if you cannot answer it, then you must give me the 30 suits of clothing." "Let us hear your riddle," they said. And this was Samson's riddle. Out of the eater came forth meat, and out of the strong came forth sweetness. They could not find the answer, though they tried to find it all that day, and the 2 days that followed. And at last they came to Samson's wife and said to her, "Coax your husband to tell you the answer. If you do not find it out, we will set your house on fire and burn you and all your people." and Samson's wife urged him to tell her the answer. She cried and pleaded with him and said, "If you really loved me, you would not keep this secret from me." At last, Samson yielded and told his wife how he had killed the lion and afterward found the honey in its body. She told her people, and just before the end of the feast, they came to Samson with the answer. They said, "What is sweeter than honey, and what is stronger than a lion?" And Samson said to them, "If you had not plowed with my heifer, you had not found out my riddle." By his heifer, which is a young cow, of course Samson meant his wife. Then Samson was required to give them 30 suits of clothing. He went out among the Philistines, killed the first 30 men whom he found, took off their clothes, and gave them to the guests at the feast. But all this made Samson very angry. He left his wife and went home to his father's house. Then the parents of his wife gave her to another man. But after a time, Samson's anger passed away, and he went again to Timnath to see his wife. But her father had said to him, "You went away angry, and I supposed that you cared nothing for her. I gave her to another man, and now she is his wife. But here is a younger sister. You can have her for your wife instead." But Samson would not take his wife's sister. He went out very angry, determined to do harm to the Philistines because they had cheated him. He caught all the wild foxes that he could find until he had 300 of them. Then he tied them together in pairs by their tails, and between each pair of foxes he tied to their tails a piece of dry wood which he set on fire. These foxes with firebrands on their tails he turned loose among the fields of the Philistines when the grain was ripe. They ran wildly over the fields, set the grain on fire and burned it, and with the grain the olive trees in the fields. When the Philistines saw their harvest destroyed, they said, "Who has done this?" And the people said, "Samson did this, because his wife was given by her father to another man." The Philistines looked on Samson's father-in-law as the cause of their loss, and they came and set his home on fire, and burned the man and his daughter, whom Samson had married. Then Samson came down again, and alone fought a company of Philistines, and killed them all, as a punishment for burning his wife. After this, Samson went to live in a hollow place in a split rock, called the Rock of Etam. The Philistines came up in a great army, and overran the fields in the tribe land of Judah. "Why do you come against us?" asked the men of Judah. "What do you want from us?" "We have come," they said, "to bind Samson, and to deal with him as he had dealt with us." The men of Judah said to Samson, "Do you not know that the Philistines are ruling over us? Why do you make them angry by killing their people? You see that we suffer through your pranks. Now we must bind you and give you to the Philistines, or they will ruin us all." And Samson said, "I will let you bind me, if you will promise not to kill me yourselves, but only to give me safely into the hands of the Philistines." They made the promise, and Samson gave himself up to them, and allowed them to tie him up fast with new ropes. The Philistines shouted for joy as they saw their enemy brought to them, led in bonds by his own people. But as soon as Samson came among them, he burst the bonds as though they had been light strings, and picked up from the ground the jawbone of an ass, and struck right and left with it as with a sword. He killed almost 1,000 of the Philistines with this strange weapon. Afterward, he sang a song about it, thus: "With the jawbone of an ass, heaps upon heaps, with the jawbone of an ass have I slain 1,000 men." After this, Samson went down to the chief city of the Philistines, which was named Gaza. It was a large city, and like all large cities, was surrounded with a high wall. When the men of Gaza found Samson in their city, they shut the gates, thinking that they could now hold him as a prisoner. But in the night Samson rose up, went to the gates, pulled their posts out of the ground, and put the gates with their posts upon his shoulder. he carried off the gates of the city and left them on the top of a hill not far from the city of Hebron. After this, Samson saw another woman among the Philistines, and he loved her. The name of this woman was Delilah. The rulers of the Philistines came to Delilah and said to her, "Find out, if you can, what it is that makes Samson so strong, and tell us. If you help us to get control of him, so that we can have him in our power, we will give you a great sum of money." And Delilah coaxed and pleaded with Samson to tell her what it was that made him so strong. Samson said to her, "If they will tie me with 7 green twigs from a tree, then I shall not be strong any more." They brought her 7 green twigs, like those of a willow tree, and she bound Samson with them while he was asleep. Then she called out to him, "Wake up, Samson! The Philistines are coming against you." And Samson rose up and broke the twigs as easily as they had been charred in the fire, and went away with ease. And Delilah tried again to find his secret. She said, "You are only making fun of me. Now tell me truly how you can be bound." And Samson said, "Let them bind me with new ropes that have never been used before, and then I cannot get away." While Samson was asleep again, Delilah bound him with new ropes, and then she called out as before, "Get up, Samson, for the Philistines are coming." And when Samson rose up, the ropes broke as if they were thread. And Delilah again urged him to tell her, and he said, "You notice that my long hair is in 7 locks. Weave it together in the loom, just as if it were threads in a piece of cloth." Then when he was asleep, she wove his hair in the loom and fastened it with a large pin to the weaving frame. But when he awoke, he rose up and carried away the pin and the beam of the weaving frame, for he was as strong as before. And Delilah, who was anxious to serve the people, said, "Why do you tell me that you love me, as long as you deceive me and keep me from your secret?" And she pleaded with him day after day, until at last he yielded to her and told her the real secret of his strength. He said, "I am a Nazirite, under a vow to the Lord, not to drink wine and not to allow my hair to be cut. If I should let my hair be cut short, then the Lord would forsake me, and my strength would go from me, and I would be like other men." Then Delilah knew that she had found the truth at last. She sent for the rulers of Philistines, saying, "Come up this once, and you shall have your enemy, for he has told me all that is in his heart." Then while the Philistines were watching outside, Delilah let Samson go to sleep, with his head upon her knees. While he was sound asleep, they took a razor and shaved off all his hair. Then she called out as at other times, "Rise up, Samson, the Philistines are upon you." He awoke and rose up, expecting to find himself strong as before, for he did not at first know that his long hair had been cut off. But the vow to the Lord was broken, and the Lord had left him. He was now as weak as other men, and helpless in the hands of his enemies. The Philistines easily made him their prisoner, and that he might never do them more harm, he put out his eyes. Then they chained him with fetters and sent him to prison at Gaza. And in the prison they made Samson turn a heavy millstone to grind grain, just as though he were a beast of burden. But while Samson was in prison, his hair grew long again, and with his hair his strength came back to him, for Samson renewed his vow to the Lord. One day a great feast was held by the Philistines in the temple of their fish god, Dagon. For they said, "Our God has given Samson, our enemy, into our hand. Let us be glad together and praise Dagon." And the temple was thronged with people, and the roof over it was also crowded with more than 3,000 men and women. They sent for Samson to rejoice over him, and Samson was led into the court of the temple before all the people to amuse them. After a time, Samson said to the boy who was leading him, "Take me up to the front of the temple, so that I may stand by one of the pillars and lean against it." And while Samson stood between the two pillars, he prayed, "O Lord God, remember me, I pray thee, and give me strength, only this once, O God, and help me, that I may obtain vengeance upon the Philistines for my 2 eyes." Then he placed one arm around the pillar on one side, and the other arm around the pillar on the other side. And he said, "Let me die with the Philistines." And he bowed forward with all his might, and pulled the pillars over with him, bringing down the roof and all upon it, upon those that were under it. Samson himself was among the dead, but in his death he killed more of the Philistines than he had killed during his life. Then, in the terror which came upon the Philistines, the men of Samson's tribe came down and found his dead body, and buried it in their own land. After that, it was years before the Philistines tried again to rule over the Israelites. Samson did much to set his people free, but he might have done much more if he had led his people, instead of trusting alone to his own strength, and if he had lived more earnestly and not done his deeds as though he was playing pranks. There were deep faults in Samson, but at the end he sought God's help and found it, and God used Samson to set his people free. End of the story of Samson, the strong man. The story of Gideon and his 300 soldiers. At last, the people of Israel came into the promised land, but they did evil in the sight of the Lord in worshipping Baal, and the Lord left them to suffer for their sins. Once the Midianites, living near the desert on the east of Israel, came against the tribes. The 2 tribes that suffered the hardest fate were Ephraim and the part of Manasseh on the west of Jordan. For 7 years, the Midianites swept over their land every year, just at the time of harvest, and carried away all the crops of grain, until the Israelites had no food for themselves, and none for their sheep and cattle. The Midianites brought also their own flocks and camels without number, which ate all the grass of the field. The people of Israel were driven away from their villages and their farms, and were compelled to hide in the caves of the mountains. And if any Israelite could raise any grain, he buried it in pits covered with earth, or in empty wine presses, where the Midianites could not find it. One day, a man named Gideon was threshing out wheat in a hidden place, when he saw an angel sitting under an oak tree. The angel said to him, "You are a brave man, Gideon, and the Lord is with you. Go out boldly and save your people from the power of the Midianites." Gideon answered the angel, "O Lord, how can I save Israel? Mine is a poor family in Manasseh, and I am the least in my father's house." And the Lord said to him, "Surely I will be with you, and I will help you drive out the Midianites." Gideon felt that it was the Lord who was talking to him in the form of an angel. He brought an offering and laid it on a rock before the angel. Then the angel touched the offering with his staff. At once a fire leaped up and burned the offering, and then the angel vanished from his sight. Gideon was afraid when he saw this, but the Lord said to him, "Peace be unto you, Gideon. Do not fear, for I am with you." On the spot where the Lord appeared to Gideon under an oak tree, near the village of Ophrah, in the tribe land of Manasseh, Gideon built an altar and called it by a name which means, "The Lord is peace." This altar was standing long afterward in that place. Then the Lord told Gideon that before setting his people free from the Midianites, he must first set them free from the service of Baal and Asherah, the 2 idols most worshipped among them. Near the house of Gideon's own father stood an altar to Baal and the image of Asherah. On that night, Gideon went out with 10 men and threw down the image of Baal and cut in pieces the wooden image of Asherah and destroyed the altar before these idols. And in its place he built an altar to the God of Israel, and on it lay the broken pieces of the idols for wood, and with them offered a young ox as a burnt offering. On the next morning, when the people of the village went out to worship their idols, they found them cut in pieces, the altar taken away. In its place an altar of the Lord, and on it the pieces of the Asherah were burning as wood under a sacrifice to the Lord. The people looked at the broken and burning idols, and they said, "Who has done this?" Someone said, "Gideon, the son of Joash, did this last night." Then they came to Joash, Gideon's father, and said, "We are going to kill your son, because he has destroyed the image of Baal, who is our God." And Joash, Gideon's father, said, "If Baal is a god, he can take care of himself, and punish the man who has destroyed his image. Why should you help Baal? Let Baal help himself." And when they saw that Baal could not harm the man who had broken down his altar and his image, the people turned from Baal back to their own Lord God. Gideon sent messengers through all Manasseh on the west of Jordan, and the tribes near on the north. And the men of the tribes gathered around him, with a few swords and spears, but very few, for the Israelites were not ready for war. They met beside a great spring on Mount Gilboa, called the Fountain of Harod. Mount Gilboa is one of the 3 mountains on the east of the plain of Esdraelon, or the plain of Jezreel, where once there had been a great battle. On the plain stretching up the side of another of these mountains, called the Mountain of Moreh, was the camp of a vast Midianite army. For as soon as the Midianites heard that Gideon had undertaken to set his people free, they came against him with a mighty host. Gideon was a man of faith. He wished to be sure that God was leading him, and he prayed to God and said, "O Lord God, give me some sign that thou wilt save Israel through me. Here is a fleece of wool on this threshing floor. If tomorrow morning the fleece is wet with dew, while the grass around it is dry, then I shall know what thou art with me, and that thou wilt give me victory over the Midianites." Very early the next morning, Gideon came to look at the fleece. He found it wringing wet with dew, while all around the grass was dry. But Gideon was not yet satisfied. He said to the Lord, "O Lord, be not angry with me, but give me just one more sign. Tomorrow morning, let the fleece be dry, and let the dew fall all around it, and then I will doubt no more." The next morning, Gideon found the grass and the bushes wet with dew, while the fleece of wool was dry. And Gideon was now sure that God had called him, and that God would give him victory over the enemies of Israel. The Lord said to Gideon, "Your army is too large. If Israel should win the victory, they would say, 'We won it by our own might.' Send home all those who are afraid to fight." For many of the people were frightened as they looked at the host of their enemies. And the Lord knew that these men would only hinder the rest in the battle. So Gideon sent word through the camp, "Whoever is afraid of the enemy may go home." And 22,000 people went away, leaving only 10,000 in Gideon's army. But the army was stronger, though it was smaller, for the cowards had gone, and only the brave men were left. But the Lord said to Gideon, "The people are yet too many. You need only a few of the bravest and best men to fight in this battle. Bring the men down the mountain, past the water, and I will show you there how to find the men whom you need." In the morning, Gideon, by God's command, called his 10,000 men out, and made them march down the hill, just as though they were going to attack the enemy. And as they were beside the water, he noticed how they drank, and set them apart in 2 companies, according to their way of drinking. When they came to the water, most of the men threw aside their shields and spears, and knelt down and scooped up a draught of the water with both hands together like a cup. These men Gideon commanded to stand in 1 company. There were a few men who did not stop to take a large draught of water, holding spear and shield in the right hand, to be ready for the enemy if one should suddenly appear. He merely caught up a handful of water in passing and marched on, lapping up the water from one hand. God said to Gideon, "Set by themselves these men who lapped up each a handful of water. These are the men whom I have chosen to set Israel free." Gideon counted these men and found that there were only 300 of them, while all the rest bowed down on their faces to drink. The difference between them was that 300 men were earnest men, of one purpose, not turning aside from their aim even to drink, as the others did. Then too, they were watchful men, always ready to meet their enemies. So Gideon, at God's command, sent back to the camp on Mount Gilboa all the rest of his army, nearly 10,000 men, keeping with himself only his little band of 300. Gideon's plan did not need a large army, but it needed a few careful, bold men who should do exactly as the leader commanded them. He gave to each man a lamp, a pitcher, and a trumpet, and told the man just what was to be done with them. The lamp was lighted, but was placed inside the pitcher, so that it could not be seen. He divided his men into 3 companies, and very quietly led them down the mountain in the middle of the night, and arranged them all in order around the camp of the Midianites. Then, at one moment, a great shout rang out in the darkness, "The sword of the Lord and of Gideon!" And after it came a crash of breaking pitchers, and then a flash of light in every direction. The 300 men had given the shout and broken their pitchers, so that on every side lights were shining. The men blew their trumpets with a mighty noise, and the Midianites were aroused from sleep to see enemies all round them, lights beaming and swords flashing, while everywhere the sharp sound of the trumpets was heard. They were filled with sudden terror, and thought only of escape, not of fighting. But wherever they turned, the enemy seemed to be standing with swords drawn. They trampled each other down to death, flying from the Israelites. Their own land was in the east, across the river Jordan, and they fled in that direction, down one of the valleys between the mountains. Gideon had thought the Midianites would turn toward their own land if they should be beaten in the battle, and he had already planned to cut off their flight. The 10,000 men in the camp he had placed on the sides of the valley leading to Jordan. There they slew very many of the Midianites as they fled down the steep pass toward the river. And Gideon had also sent 2 of the men of the tribe of Ephra, who had far taken no part in the war, to hold the only place at the river where men could wade through the water. Those of the Midianites who had escaped from Gideon's men on either side of the valley were now met by the Ephraimites at the river, and many more of them were slain. Among the slain were 2 of the princes of the Midianites, named Oreb and Zeb. A part of the Midianite army was able to get across the river and to continue its flight toward the desert, but Gideon and his brave 300 men followed closely after them, fought another battle with them, destroyed them utterly, and took their 2 kings, Zebah and Zalmunna, whom he killed. After this great victory, the Israelites were free forever from the Midianites. They never again ventured to leave their home in the desert to make war on the tribes of Israel. After this, as long as Gideon lived, he ruled as judge in Israel. The people wished him to make himself a king. "Rule over us as king," they said, "and let your son be king after you, and his son king after him." But Gideon said, "No, you have a king already, for the Lord God is the king of Israel. No one but God shall be king over these tribes." Of all the 15 men who ruled as judges of Israel, Gideon, the 5th judge, was the greatest, in courage, in wisdom, and in faith in God. End of the story of Gideon and his 300 soldiers.